Why does it always take decades for the justice system to realize that they got the wrong guy?
Fly. Fall. 3, 2, 1.
Good evening, my anonymous brothers and sisters out there who find comfort and nourishment in the shadows like myself. What I'm going to talk to you about today is the story of Sidney Holmes. This gentleman just spent 34 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. And what's so strange and what baffles me is the fact that it always takes decades for the justice system to realize that they made a mistake. I rarely hear about stories of people who've gotten out of jail after spending a year or even 5 years in jail and exonerated. It's always after 25 years, 34 years, 45 years, sometimes in rare occasions, 50 years in prison, wrongfully convicted, freed. I just don't understand that. But better late than never, I suppose. So this is the story and the news about Sidney Holmes. This gentleman, he was young. He was sent to prison at the age of 23 years old. He's now 57. He spent the majority of his life behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Now, what's also so strange is that he was sent to jail because they said he was the getaway driver for two men who robbed a couple back in 1988. They did an armed robbery. He was the getaway driver, and they sentenced this man to 400 years in prison. Now, I don't know about you, but anything absent the taking of a life and some child abuse, egregious child abuse cases, it's really any logical reason that you are sentence someone for 400 years simply for being a getaway driver, even if they had a history, a criminal history. So what we're going to do, as always, I gave you a slight breakdown of what we're going to be discussing. I'm about to play the news video for you and give you some more of my commentary. Alright, family, here we go.
It's the first taste of freedom in 34 years for Sidney Holmes.
I know this day was going to come, sooner or later, and today is the day.
The emotional moment got the best of Sidney's mother, who in 1989 watched her then 23-year-old son be convicted for a crime he did not commit.
You got to stay humble. God is first.
Today, Sidney is 57 and finally a free man.
I can't put it into words. It's over with.
Did you ever doubt today was possible?
I never doubted because I kept my faith.
Earlier in the day, Sidney shed a tear as a judge tossed out his armed robbery conviction and 400-year prison sentence.
There's no evidence tying Mr. Holmes to the robbery.
He was accused of driving two men who robbed a couple at gunpoint outside of a Fort Lauderdale convenience store. The thieves were never found, but Sidney's own persistence about his innocence led to an investigation by the Broward State Attorney's Conviction Review Unit, and they found Holmes did have an alibi and that a shaky witness misidentified him and his car.
And ultimately, all of us came to the same conclusion that this man was wrongfully convicted, that this man shouldn't have been in prison, and we needed to get him out right now.
Decades of lost time, but a chance at a fresh start without any animosity or anger.
Well, the Christian faith I have, I can't hate. I just have to keep moving.
And there you have it. I feel happy for the gentleman, but I also feel very sad because that's 34 years this man would never be able to get back in his life, being caged like an animal for something you didn't do. That's a very helpless feeling to have. And not only that, not only was he sentenced and imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit, but to be told you're going to spend 400 years for a crime you didn't commit. I can only imagine how many times this brother gave up hope. 34 years of his life he can't get back. And I'm not hearing anything about any sort of compensation, at least not yet. Usually when I hear about these stories, they already have a financial compensation package within the article and on the news broadcast, but with this one, I haven't heard of any financial compensation for that, which it should be coming soon. But the sad part, another part of the point I was trying to make about the sad part, is that when you go into prison or you go into any situation, you move to a different country with a different culture, you go to a different school, anywhere where you go and you spend a significant amount of time there, your mentality changes, your vocabulary changes, your outlook on life changes. And for this man to spend the majority of his life when he went in there as a young man to be institutionalized, I feel really bad for him because it's going to be very hard for him to adjust to life outside now. The man went into prison innocent, and hopefully he doesn't come out and be found guilty of something, because that happens often. There are a lot of cases of people who were freed from jail for crimes they didn't commit, but they were in there for so long that they became criminally institutionalized, that they just turned to crime when they got out. Totally different personality, totally different outlook and set of values than when they went in there. And I hope this isn't the situation for this gentleman. I really do. I hope he gets out, stays out, and somehow he makes up for those lost times. I don't even think he has kids from the research that I've done. And so, not sure if he even has the desire to have kids at his age, but he missed out on a tremendous amount of normal, everyday things that humans do in order to exist. I want to read a couple of lines from this article. I want to mainly focus on the crime itself, because what's the difference now? If now we can see that this man was innocent, why couldn't they see it then? That's a question I always have in these situations. It wasn't DNA that exonerated this man. In those situations, I kind of see why we don't, how they can be like, we don't know if he did it. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then he got convicted and he got exonerated because of DNA. But it didn't even take DNA for this man to get out of jail and everybody to know that he was wrongfully convicted. It was just simple research of the case. So, here we go. It says, quote, a strange set of circumstances led to Holmes becoming a suspect, the Innocent Project of Florida said. One of the two victims described the car used in the robbery as a brown Oldsmobile Colors with a tan top and a hole in the trunk. Weeks later, the victim's brother saw a brown Cutlass driving down the road and reported the license plate number to authorities. That car was registered to Holmes, the Innocent Project said. Now, with this situation, the brother of the victim who decided to write the license plate down of a cutlass that he saw and give it to authorities, as if Mr. Holmes's cutlass was the only one ever made, or even the only one in the state of Florida. And for the fact that Mr. Holmes had a similar looking vehicle, and he was black, and he had a criminal record by the age of 23, was pretty much in the detectives and the prosecutions and obviously the jury's eyes to say, well, who else could have done it? Just those three things: a previous record, a similar vehicle, and him being black. So, to further go on and about how it's strange that he was even convicted of this crime in the first place, was that he had an alibi. If you check someone's alibi and it checks out, and it's pretty obvious that this person could not have done the crime because he was nowhere near where the crime took place, pretty much that kind of dismisses any and all eyewitness testimonies that you have, because all too often eyewitness testimonies cannot be relied upon. People's memory is not as clear as you might think it is. A lot of times your mind will fill in the gaps with information that may not be true, and you don't even realize it until you relate that story to someone who shared that experience with you, and they correct your memory of things. It happens every day, all the time, especially in stressful situations where your life is in danger. And because Sidney was the getaway driver, I'm not sure how they even identified him in the lineup. He wasn't one of the two men who robbed you, who was face to face with you. So how could you pick the getaway driver out of the lineup? And they never found his two accomplices who supposedly had actually done the robbery. It's just a lot of holes and a lot of lazy detective work. A lot of shady prosecution, a shitty defense attorney, and just clueless juries that created the perfect storm that got this man 34 goddamn years in jail. Continuing with the article, quote, "There was no physical or scientific evidence, nor any corroborating witnesses linking Mr. Holmes to the crime," unquote. And that was according to the Innocence Project. Mr. Holmes was identified by one of the victims in the second photo lineup, despite not being identified during the initial lineup, the lawyer's statement reads. So one of the victims was not able to pick Mr. Holmes out of a lineup, but then the second time they picked him. What normally happens in those situations is that the police may inform the victim about who it likely could have been, or they put ideas in a person's head about who they should pick, who's close enough to their description. And that second time they did the lineup, the photo lineup, that's when they picked Mr. Holmes, when they couldn't even do it the first time. Continuing with the article, it says, based on a recent review of the case, prosecutors determined that Holmes had a plausible claim of innocence because of how he became a suspect and because of a precarious eyewitness identification that was the principal evidence against him at the trial. Now, the main piece of evidence was him being simply identified by someone. There was no physical evidence, and they said there was no scientific, genetic DNA evidence. There was no sort of evidence besides someone recalling that he looked it like he could have been the guy who did it, and that was enough for a jury and a judge to say that's good enough for them too. Just sad. Anyway, it says a judge on Monday approved the request from the state's attorney's office and the Innocence Project to vacate Holmes' sentence and conviction. The prosecutors dismissed the charge. That afternoon, Holmes walked out of Broward County Detention Facility and into the arms of his mother and family in an emotional embrace. One thing I also want to mention is the fact that in the past 15 years that I've been paying attention, and I've been actively searching for issues and topics regarding police and the criminal justice system and their relationship with the black community. It's been a huge number of people who have been released from prison because they were falsely accused of a crime that they didn't commit. A staggering number. And so when you hear people say that black people are only 13% of the population, but they commit most of the crimes, or they are the biggest jail population, and then they attribute that to black people simply being genetically or culturally predisposed to violence and crime, it's a lie. Because here in an article titled "Wrongfully Convicted: Why More Falsely Accused People Are Being Exonerated Today Than Ever Before," they did a study, a very comprehensive study, if I do say so myself, of the numbers of people who are exonerated, and then they tied that to the number of people who are still in prison who are likely innocent, and they coincided that with the number of people who are in jail and are guilty. And this information is quite alarming and scary. But one thing I wanted to mainly point out is this diagram over here, the racial bias of black and white people in the prison system. Now, the top right diagram says the U.S. population is 77% white, 13% black, and ever since I was a teenager, I'm much older than a teenager now, but ever since the early 90s, I've been hearing that the black population is 13% of the population. It never went up, it never went down, and that's an absolute lie. And white people are not 77% of this nation's population. Not Caucasian, European white, at least. You have, even on applications, it says, are you white, Hispanic, white, non-Hispanic? So what they do in order to fluff the white numbers up, they begin to put Hispanics who are white skinned instead of Caucasian blood into the white population. And that's what fluffs up the white Caucasian numbers. Even some people from the Middle East and Asia are classified as white. Kamala Harris' birth certificate, or is it her mother? I believe it's Kamala Harris's birth certificate that has her listed as Caucasian. Now, in America, white means Caucasian. But in other societies and cultures, white means pure, royal blood, high status. Not necessarily the color, but association with the status of upper class. race is constructed differently around the world than it is in America. In America, it's pretty straightforward. Either you're white or you're non-white. In the rest of the world, they have a more of a shading scale. It's even affected a lot of people in Asian America. I mean, look how white a lot of these Asian people look. Look how they bleach their skin over there, and their entire society is ingrained with the worship of whiteness. I mean, look at their anime and their video games. The poor parts of Japan tend to be the darker Japanese. The wealthier parts of Japan tend to be the lighter skin, whiter skin, paler skin, more specifically, of Japan. Lots of cultures around the world worship whiteness and are doing very specific things to obtain that whiteness. Not only are they bleaching their skin, but they're also breeding themselves into a lighter skin shade. Anyway, so we're just going to go with the 77% white and the 13% black. And when you break that down into inmate jail and prison population, 59% of the prison population is white and 38% is black. Now, if you have 77% of the country that's white, you expect them to be the majority of the prison population simply by sheer numbers and probability of it's just so many more of them to fill up the jails than there are of anyone else. So that's what you would expect. But when it comes to the black side, and you say with 13% of the population, but 38% of the prison population, now that's alarming. That's scary. Because such a very small percentage of the nation's population, not even a quarter of the nation, less than a quarter, almost half, well, pretty much half of a quarter of the nation's population is 38% of the prison's population. That is astonishing and frightening. But what's more astonishing and frightening, but other than that number, is the percentage of those exonerated for crimes that they didn't commit. And almost half of the people who are exonerated from crimes that they didn't commit are black. So what you have is a system who not only lies about the number of people we have as black people in this country, but then they imprison us disproportionately for crimes we didn't commit. And then as for whatever miracle happens, it's proven that almost half of the brothers in jail are innocent. So this isn't a justice system. This is more of a slave system, because in prisons these people are, for the most part, forced to work for slave labor. So it's more of a, you just gathering up as many as you can and put them in these detention centers and prisons and jails. Whether they did it or not, gather as many of the black men from society as you can and store them away. Separate them from the rest of the population and the rest of society. So when people say from this point forward, based on information I gave you and the article to look up, if you ever want to read the entire thing, when they say black people are disproportionately people in prison, you say, yeah, we certainly are disproportionately a high rate of prison inmates, but we're also disproportionately a higher number of the exonerated rates of freed for crimes we didn't commit also. So that goes back to the brother Sidney Holmes. He was another brother who fell into this percentage of exonerated black, and part of that 13% and the 38% was an inmate of being a victim of the American justice system that for the most part, at least nearly half the time, don't give a damn whether you're innocent or you're guilty, but you just need to be separated from the rest of society because you're black, because of racism. These numbers don't say racism. History says racism. Right? The history of America says racism, not the numbers. But what those numbers do say, without saying it at all, is there's a very serious goddamn problem with the American justice system. It's not a justice system, actually. It's just a machine. It's called the status quo machine. House and store as many black bodies away from the rest of society as you can, whether it be dead or in jail, to make sure that that 13% makes more sense than not, because we're definitely more than 13% of the American population. If you're as old as I am, I'm sure when you were a teenager you heard we were 13% of the goddamn population as well. And how many decades ago was that? So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters who remain anonymous, who love anonymity, who feed off the darkness and the shadows. Thank you again for joining me. This is Steve with No Names Media. Stay safe out there. Try to avoid any interaction with the police as best as you can. But if you do find yourself in the company of police officers and you're the target, do the 3 F's. Don't fuss, don't fight, don't flee. Good night.